Welcome to my home sweet cottage, where life is simple and sweet. The First 4 Years, Chapter 1, Part 3. For 3 days and nights the blizzard raged. Before Manly went to the barn again, he followed the house wall to where the long rope clothesline was tied at the corner. With his hand on the rope, he followed it to the back of the house. Unfastening it at the corner, he followed the house around to the door and fastened the rope there. And to the loose end he tied a shorter rope, the drying line he had put up in the storm shed. Now, unreeling the rope as he went, he could go to the haystack at the barn door, make the rope fast, and follow it back to the house safely. After that, he went to the barn and cared for the stock once a day. While the blizzard shrieked and howled and raged outside, Laura and Manly both stayed indoors. Laura kept the fire going from the store of coal in the storm shed. She cooked from the stores in her pantry and cellar, and she sang at her knitting in the afternoon. Old Shep and the cat lay companionable on the rug before the cook stove, and there was warmth and comfort in the little house standing so sturdily in the midst of the raging elements. Late in the afternoon of the 4th day the wind went down. It lost its whirling force and blew the loose snow scudding close to the ground, packing it into hard drifts that lay over the prairie with bare ground showing between. The sun shone again with a frosty light, and huge sundogs stood guard on each side of it. And it was cold. Laura and Manly went outdoors and looked over the desolate landscape. Their ears still throbbed to the tumult of the storm, and the silence following it was somehow confusing. "This has been very bad," Manly said. "We will hear of plenty of damage from this." Laura looked at the smoke rising from the stovepipe in the neighbor's house across the road. She had not been able to see it for 3 days. "Larsons are all right anyway," she said. Next day Manly drove to town to get a few supplies and to learn the news. The house was bright and cheerful when he came home. The last rays of afternoon sun was shining in at the south window, and Laura was ready to help him off with his coat as he came in from the barn after putting up his team and doing the night feeding. But Manly was very sober. After they ate supper, he told Laura the news. A man south of town, caught at his barn by the storm as Manly had been, had missed the house going back. He had wandered out on the prairie and had been found frozen to death when the wind went down. 3 children going home from school had become lost, but found a haystack and dug into it. They had huddled together for warmth and had been drifted in. When the storm stopped, the oldest, a boy, had dug out through the snow, and searchers had found them. They were weak from hunger, but not frozen. Range cattle had drifted before the storm for 100 miles. Blinded and confused, they had gone over a high bank of the Cottonwood River, the later ones falling on top of the first, breaking through the ice of the river and floundering in the water and loose snow until they had smothered and frozen to death. Men were dragging them out of the river now, hundreds of them, and skinning them to save the hides. Anyone who had lost cattle could go look at the brands and claim his own. The storm so early in the season was unexpected, and many people had been caught out in the snow and had frozen their hands and feet. Another storm came soon, but people were prepared now, and no damage was done. It was too cold for horseback riding, and snow covered the ground, so Manly hitched the driving team to the cutter, the little one-seated sleigh, on Sunday afternoons. Then he and Laura drove here and there, over to Paul's farm to see the home folks, or to the Boasts, old friends who lived several miles to the east. But the drives were always short ones, no 20 or 40 miles now. It was too dangerous, for a storm might come up suddenly and catch them away from home. Barnum and Skip were not working now. They were fat and frisky and enjoyed the sleigh rides as much as Laura and Manly. They pranced and danced purposely to make their sleigh bells ring more merrily, while their ears twitched alertly and their eyes shone. Trixie and Fly, the saddle ponies, Kate and Bill, the working team, were growing fat in the barn and took their exercise in the haystack-sheltered barnyard at the back. The holidays were near, and something must be done about them. The Boast and the Ingalls families had spent them together whenever they could. Thanksgiving dinner at Boast's, Christmas dinner at the Ingalls home. Now with Laura and Manly there was a new family, and it was agreed to add another gathering to those 2 holidays. New Year's should be celebrated at the Wilders. Christmas presents were hardly to be thought of, the way the crops had turned out, but Manly made hand sleds for Laura's little sisters, and they would buy Christmas candy for all. For themselves, they decided to buy a present together, something they could both use and enjoy. After much studying of the Montgomery Ward's catalog, they chose to get a set of glassware. They needed it for the table, and there was such a pretty set advertised: a sugar bowl, spoon holder, butter dish, 6 sauce dishes, and a large oval-shaped bread plate. On the bread plate, raised in the glass, were heads of wheat and some lettering which read, "Give us this day our daily bread." When the box came from Chicago a few days before Christmas and was unpacked, they were both delighted with their present. The holidays were soon over, and in February, Laura's 19th birthday came. Manly's 29th birthday was just a few weeks later, so they made one celebration for both on the Sunday between. It wasn't much of a celebration, just a large birthday cake for the two of them, and a little extra pains were taken in the cooking and arranging of the simple meal of bread, meat, and vegetables. Laura had become quite a good cook and an expert in the making of light bread. With work and play, in sunshine and storm, the winter passed. There was very little visiting or having company, for neighbors were rather far away, except for the Larsons across the road, and the days were short. Still, Laura was never lonely. She loved her little house and the housework. There were always Shep and the cat, and a visit to the horses and cows at the barn was, she thought, as good as visiting people any day. When Trixie lipped her hand or rested her soft nose on her shoulder, or Skip, the scamp, searched her pocket for a lump of sugar, she felt that they were very satisfactory friends. The wild geese were coming back from the Southland. They flew overhead from one lake to the other, where they rested on the water and fed along the shores. The ground was bare of snow, and although the nights were cold and the wind often chilly, the sunshine was warm and spring had come. Manly was getting his plows and harrows in order for working the land to be ready for the sowing of wheat and oats. He must get an early start at the work, for there were 100 acres to sow in wheat and 50-acre oat field on the homestead. At the shanty on the homestead, Laura held the grain sacks while he shoveled the wheat into them. He was hauling them to the home barn to be handy for the sowing. The shanty was cold. The grain sacks were coarse and rough to the touch, and the wheat was dusty. Watching the plump wheat kernels slide into the open mouth of the sack made Laura dizzy. If she took her eyes from them, they were drawn irresistibly to the newspapers pasted on the shanty walls, and she read the words over and over. She was unreasonably annoyed because some of them were bottom side up,
Everything
but
is
she
evened
must
up in
read
this
them
world.
anyway. She couldn't take her eyes from them. Words, words. The world was full of words and sliding wheat kernels. And then she heard Manly saying, "Sit down a minute. You're tired." So she sat down, but she was not tired. She was sick. The next morning she felt much worse, and Manly got his own breakfast. For days she fainted whenever she left her bed. The doctor told her to lie quietly. He assured her she would feel much better before long, and that in a few months, 9 to be exact, she would be quite all right. Laura was going to have a baby. So that was it. Well, she mustn't shirk. She must get around and do the work in the house so that Manly could get the crops in. So much depended on this year's crops, and there was no money to hire help. Soon Laura was creeping around the house, doing what must be done, and whenever possible, relieving her dizzy head by lying down for a few minutes. The little house grew to look rather dingy, for she couldn't give it the care it had always had. As she went so miserably about her work, she would smile wryly now and then as she remembered a saying of her mother's: "They that dance must pay the fiddler." Well, she was paying, but she would do the work. She would help that much in spite of everything. The trees were not growing very well. The dry weather of the summer had been hard on them, and they must be given extra care. For years from now, there must be the 10 acres from the right numbers of growing trees in order to prove up on the tree claim and get a title to the land. So Manly plowed around the little trees and then mulched them with manure from the barnyard. Laura missed the drives over the greening prairie in the freshness of early spring. She missed the wild violets that scented the air with their fragrance. But when wild rose time came in June, she was able to ride behind Skip and Barnum along the country roads where the prairie roses on their low bushes made glowing masses of color from pale pink to deepest red, and the air was full of their sweetness. On one such drive, she asked abruptly out of silence, "What shall we name the child?" "We can't name it now," Manly replied, "for we don't know if it will be a boy or a girl." And after another silence, Laura said, "It will be a girl, and we will call her Rose." It rained often that spring. It rained through the summer, and the little trees took courage and waved their little green leaves in the wind while they stretched taller every day. The wild blue stem grass grew on the high prairie, and the slough grass grew rank in the sloughs where water stood in the lowest places. And oh, how the wheat and oats did grow, for it rained. The days went by and by, and the wheat headed tall and strong and green and beautiful. Then the grain was in the milk, and in just a few days more the crop would be safe. Even if it turned dry now, there would be a good crop, for the stalks would ripen the wheat. At last, one day Manly came in from the field. He had been looking it over and decided it was ready to cut. The wheat, he said, was perfect. It would go all of 40 bushels to the acre and be number one hard. The price would start at 75 cents a bushel, delivered at the elevator in town. "Didn't I tell you," he said, "that everything's even up? The rich have their ice in the summer, but the poor get theirs in the winter." He laughed, and Laura laughed with him. It was wonderful. In the morning, Manly had to go to town and buy a new binder to harvest the wheat. He had waited until he was sure there would be a good crop before buying it, for it was expensive, $200. But he would pay half after the grain was threshed and the other half in a second payment after threshing next year. He would only have to pay 8% interest on the deferred payment, and could give a chattel mortgage on the machine and cows to secure the debt. Manly went early to town. He wanted to be back in time to begin cutting the grain. Laura was proud when Manly drove into the yard with the new machine. She went out and watched while he hitched on the 4 horses and started for the oat field. The oats were ripest, and he would cut them first. As Laura went back into the house, she did a little mental arithmetic. 100 acres at 40 bushels to an acre would be 4,000 bushels of wheat. 4,000 bushels of wheat at 75 cents a bushel would be, oh, how much would it be? She'd get her pencil. 4,000 bushels at 75 cents a bushel would be $3,000. It couldn't be. Yes, that was right. Why, they would be rich. She'd say the poor did get their ice. They could pay for the mowing machine and the hay rake Manly had bought a year ago and could not pay for because the crop had been so poor. The notes of $75 and $40 and the chattel mortgage on Skip and Barnum would be due after threshing. Laura did not mind the notes so much, but she hated the chattel mortgage on the horses. She'd almost as soon have had a mortgage on Manly. Well, it would soon be paid now, and the note for the sulky plow with its chattel mortgage on the cows. She thought there were some store accounts, but was not sure. They couldn't be much anyway. Perhaps she could have someone to do the work until the baby came. Then she could rest. She needed rest, for not being able to retain her food for more than a few minutes, she had not much to live on, and was very emaciated. It would be nice to let someone else do the cooking. The smell of cooking always made her feel so nauseated now. Manly cut the 50 acres of oats with the new McCormick binder that day. He was jubilant at night. It was a wonderful crop of oats, and early tomorrow he would begin on the wheat. But the next morning, when Manly had cut twice around the wheat field, he unhitched and came back to the barn with the team. The wheat would be better for standing a couple of days longer. When he came to cut into it, it was not quite so ripe as he had thought, and he would take no chance of shrunken kernels by its being cut a little green. But it was even heavier than he had figured, and if it didn't go above 40 bushels to the acre, he was mistaken. Laura felt impatient. She was in a hurry for the wheat to be cut and safely stacked. From the window she could see the shining new binder standing at the edge of the grain, and it looked impatient too, she thought. After noon that day, the DeVals came by. Cora stopped to spend some time while her husband Walter went on to town. The DeVals were about the same age as Manly and Laura, and had been married about as long. Laura and Cora were very good friends, and it was a pleasant afternoon except for being rather uncomfortable from the heat. As the afternoon passed, it grew hotter, and there was no wind, which was unusual. It left one gasping for breath and feeling smothered. About 3 o'clock Manly came in from the barn and said it was going to rain for sure. He was glad he had not been cutting the wheat to have it lie in a rainstorm before he could get it shocked. The sunshine darkened, and the wind sighed and then fell again as it grew darker yet. Then the wind rose a little, and it grew lighter, but the light was a greenish color. Then the storm came. It rained only a little. Then hailstones began to fall, at first scattering slowly, then falling thicker and faster while the stones were larger, some of them as large as hens' eggs. Manly and Cora watched from the windows, and they could not see far into the rain and the hail, but they saw old Larson across the road come to his door and step out. Then they saw him fall, and someone reached out the door, took hold of his feet, and dragged him in. Then the door shut. "The fool," Manly said. "He got a hailstone on the head." In just 20 minutes the storm was over, and when they could see as far as the field, the binder was still there, but the wheat was lying flat. "It's got the wheat, I guess," Manly said, but Laura could not speak. Then Manly went across the road to find out what had happened to Mr. Larson. When he came back in a few minutes, he said that Mr. Larson had stepped out to pick up a hailstone so large that he wished to measure it. Just as he stooped to pick it up, another one hit him on the head. He was unconscious for several minutes after he was dragged in by the heels, but was all right now except for a sore head. "And now let's make some ice cream," Manly said. "You stir it up, Laura, and I'll gather up hailstones for ice to freeze it." Laura turned to Cora where she stood speechless, looking out the window. "Do you feel like celebrating, Cora?" she asked, and Cora answered, "No. I want to get home and see what has happened there. Ice cream would choke me." The storm had lasted only 20 minutes, but it left a desolate, rain-drenched, and hail-battered world. Unscreened windows were broken. Where there were screens, they were broken and bent. The ground was covered with hailstones so thickly it looked covered with a sheet of ice, and they even lay in drifts here and there. Leaves and branches were stripped off the young trees, and the sun shone with a feeble, watery light over the wreck. The wreck, thought Laura, of a year's work, of hopes and plans, of ease and pleasure. Well, there would be no threshers to cook for. Laura had dreaded the threshing. As Ma used to say, there is no great loss without some small gain. That she should think of as so small a gain bothered Laura. She and Cora sat white and silent until Walter drove up to the door, helped Cora into the wagon, and drove away, almost forgetting to say goodbye in their anxiety to get home and learn how bad the storm had been there. Manly went out to look at the wheat field and came in sober enough. "There is no wheat to cut," he said. "It is all threshed and pounded into the ground. $3,000 worth of wheat planted, and it's the wrong time of the year." Laura was muttering to herself. "The poor man gets his—" "What's that?" Manly asked. "I was only saying," Laura answered, "that the poor man gets his ice in the summer this time." At 2 o'clock the next day, hailstones were still lying in drifts in low places. Though plans were wrecked, the pieces must be gathered up and put together again in some shape. Winter was coming. Coal must be bought to last through. That would cost between $60 and $100. Seed grain would have to be bought for next spring's sowing. There were notes on the machinery coming due. There was the binder that had been used to cut only 50 acres of oats. There was the sulky plow and the mower and rake, the seeder that had sown the grain in the spring, and the new wagon. There was, too, the $500 still due on the building of the house. $500 debt on the house, Laura exclaimed. "Oh, I didn't know that." "No," Manly said, "I didn't think there was any need to bother you about it." But something must be done about all this, and he would go to town tomorrow and see what could be done. Perhaps he could raise money with a mortgage on the homestead. That was proved up on, thank goodness. He couldn't give a mortgage on the tree claim. That belonged to Uncle Sam until Manly had raised those trees, and Laura thought she could hear her father singing, "Our Uncle Sam is rich enough to give us all a farm." Sometimes Laura was afraid her head was a little flighty, but that extra $500 debt had been something of a shock. 500 and 200 was 700, and the wagon and the mower, she must stop counting it or she would have her head queer. Manly found he could renew all his machinery notes for a year by paying the interest. He could even make the first payment on the binder after the next harvest, postponing the second payment to the year after. He could sell all the wild hay he had for $4 a ton delivered at the railroad in town. Buyers wanted it to ship to Chicago. But he could not raise money with a mortgage on the homestead unless they were living on it. He must have money to pay the interest due, for living expenses and for seed. There was no way to get the money except by moving to the homestead. If they were living on the homestead, he could mortgage it for $800. A newcomer would buy Kate and Bill for more than Manly had paid for them. Manly would not need them, for he had found a renter for the tree claim on shares. Manly would furnish the seed. Skip and Barnum, with Trixie and Fly to do the driving, could do the work on the one place. If someone else worked the tree claim, Manly could raise more crops on the homestead and have more profit from the farms than if he tried to work both claims all by himself. An addition would have to be built on the homestead claim shanty before they moved, but they could do with one new room and a cellar underneath through using the original shanty for a storeroom. So it was decided. Manly hurried to stack the oats, which the hail had threshed to the ground, but the oat straw made good animal feed to take the place of hay, and that would leave more hay to sell. When the oats were hauled to the homestead and stacked, Manly dug the hole in the ground for the cellar, and over it built the one-room addition to the claim shanty. Then he built the frame of a barn, cut soft hay, and when it was dry, stacked it around the frame to make a hay barn. Everything was ready now for the moving. Manly and Laura moved to the homestead the next day after the barn was finished. It was the 25th of August, and the winter and the summer were the first year. So that concludes the first chapter, which was the first year. I hope that you are enjoying this reading of the first 4 years by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I hope that you stay tuned for the next reading, which will be the beginning of chapter 2, the second year. Make sure that you subscribe and hit that bell so you'll be notified of the next video.